Careful with that tray, sweetheart. This isn't your world. The words landed softly, almost casually, but the laughter that followed filled the private dining room like a sudden drop in temperature. Maya Carter stopped mid-step, her fingers tightening slightly around the silver tray balanced against her palm. The soft glow of the chandelier reflected across polished mahogany, crystal glasses, and tailored suits that probably cost more than her monthly rent. She lowered the tray slowly, her posture steady, her expression calm, but her heartbeat pressed faintly against her ribs. Jonathan Reeves leaned back in his chair, one arm draped loosely across the leather backrest, his smile thin and effortless, the kind worn by someone used to being the smartest and most powerful person in any room. Around him, executives chuckled politely, some glancing at Maya with the quiet curiosity reserved for someone who had just stepped outside her assigned role. The air smelled faintly of aged bourbon and grilled steak, and outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the Chicago skyline stretched in glittering lines of light, 72 floors below. Maya adjusted the water glass she had just placed near Jonathan's right hand, careful, precise, her movements controlled. She had learned that silence was often safer than explanation. Her black uniform was pressed but worn at the seams, the small embroidered hotel logo slightly faded from repeated washes in a shared apartment laundry room that rattled loudly at midnight. Her shift had started at 4:30 p.m., and now, nearly 3 hours later, her feet ached inside shoes she had bought on clearance 2 years ago, but her shoulders remained straight, her presence composed. "Relax," Jonathan added, swirling the ice in his glass, the soft clink echoing across the quieting room. "We're discussing a 9-figure acquisition. It's not exactly a diner lunch rush." A few more soft laughs followed, polite and measured. Maya nodded once, her voice gentle. "Yes, sir." She stepped back, hands folded lightly in front of her apron, her eyes lowered but alert. The conversation resumed, voices calm but sharpened with strategy, numbers flowing across the table like quiet currents. Maya listened without appearing to listen, a habit she had formed long before she ever carried trays in executive rooms. Words like liability transfer, equity dilution, and post-merger exposure drifted through the air. Jonathan's tone was confident, decisive. He leaned forward slightly, tapping the printed contract near his elbow, the white paper bright beneath the chandelier's warm light. "Once we sign tonight, the acquisition moves forward Monday morning. Clean, simple, controlled." His pen rested between his fingers, hovering above the final page. Maya's gaze flickered briefly toward the document, then away, her breath slowing as something subtle caught her attention. The faint rustle of paper. The phrasing she had heard just seconds earlier. A quiet detail buried beneath confident voices. She felt the familiar pull of recognition, the same instinct that had once guided her through long nights studying borrowed textbooks at a community college library that stayed open until midnight. She remained still, her fingers lightly touching the edge of the tray, her mind tracing the words she had overheard. The room felt warmer now, the hum of the city distant beyond thick glass, and Jonathan Reeves lifted his pen slightly higher, ready to sign, his expression calm, assured, unaware that the quiet waitress standing 3 feet away had just noticed something that could change everything. The pen remained suspended above the paper as Maya stood quietly beside the table, her breathing steady despite the faint tightening in her chest. She had learned long ago that speaking too quickly could make people stop listening, especially in rooms like this, where confidence often outweighed caution. The executives continued discussing projections, their voices calm and measured, but Maya's attention remained fixed on the document resting beneath Jonathan Reeves's hand. The polished wood table reflected the warm chandelier light, and the faint hum of the city outside blended with the soft clink of ice melting in glasses. Maya shifted her weight slightly, her shoes pressing against the thick carpet, absorbing the sound of her movement. She glanced once toward the window, where distant headlights traced slow lines along Lakeshore Drive, then back to the contract. Her mind replayed the phrase she had overheard, a clause that sounded routine at first but carried a subtle shift in responsibility. She remembered nights sitting in the quiet corner of Harold Washington Library, her fingers turning pages slowly, trying to understand legal language that often felt deliberately confusing. Back then, she had studied after long shifts at a grocery store, her notebook filled with handwritten notes and highlighted definitions, each page marked by determination more than certainty. Her mother's voice echoed faintly in her memory, reminding her that knowledge was something no one could take away once it settled in your mind. Maya inhaled slowly, her gaze returning to Jonathan Reeves as he tapped the paper once more. He looked confident, relaxed, as though the decision had already been made long before tonight. One of the executives leaned forward, adjusting his tie, while another reviewed figures on a tablet, the faint glow illuminating his face. Maya felt the moment narrowing, like a door slowly closing. She knew she should step away, continue her duties, disappear into the background as expected. That was the safest choice, the one she had followed countless times before. Yet the quiet certainty in her chest did not fade. It grew steadier, like the calm before a decision. She lowered her tray onto a nearby service cart, her hands careful and deliberate. The faint wheels shifted softly against the carpet as she released it, her fingers resting briefly on the metal edge. Her eyes moved once more across the contract, catching the line that confirmed her concern. She felt the air in the room tighten, though no one else seemed to notice. Jonathan lifted the pen again, his expression unchanged, while the executives leaned back, ready for the final step. Maya's heartbeat slowed rather than quickened, her shoulders relaxing as clarity settled in. She took a small step forward, not interrupting, not rushing, simply positioning herself close enough that her voice would carry without force. The chandelier light reflected faintly. Across her name tag, the letters slightly worn but still readable. Maya Carter. She drew a quiet breath, her voice calm and respectful when she finally spoke, the words measured and steady, shaped by both caution and conviction. Sir, I might be mistaken, but I think there is something important in that clause. The conversation stopped almost instantly, not abruptly, but like a room pausing to understand an unexpected sound. A few heads turned slowly toward her, expressions shifting from casual focus to mild confusion. Jonathan Reeves did not move at first. His pen hovered once more, his eyes lifting gradually toward Maya, his expression composed but faintly curious, as though he was deciding whether the interruption deserved attention. The room fell into a quiet that felt heavier than before, the city lights outside flickering silently beyond the glass, and Maya remained still, her posture calm, her gaze steady, waiting. Jonathan Reeves finally set the tip of the pen against the paper but did not sign, his gaze lifting slowly toward Maya Carter, as if measuring the distance between her words and his decision. The faint reflection of the chandelier shimmered across his silver watch, and the quiet in the room stretched just long enough for everyone to notice the shift. One of the executives cleared his throat softly, while another leaned back, folding his arms, curiosity beginning to replace amusement. Jonathan tilted his head slightly, his expression calm but edged with skepticism. Something important, he repeated, his voice even, controlled, the tone of a man accustomed to evaluating risks but not interruptions from someone in a server uniform. Maya remained still, her hands relaxed at her sides, her posture composed. Yes, sir, she answered quietly. The liability language in the acquisition section sounds like it transfers more responsibility than intended. A faint ripple moved across the table as a few executives exchanged glances. Jonathan leaned forward, resting his forearms lightly against the polished wood, studying her now with more attention than before. You reviewed the contract? He asked, not harshly, but with a calm disbelief that carried its own weight. Maya shook her head slightly. No, sir. I only heard part of the discussion, but the phrasing sounded familiar. A soft exhale came from the far end of the table, followed by a restrained smile from a man in a navy suit. This is a first, he murmured quietly, though not quietly enough. Jonathan did not smile. Instead, he slid the contract a few inches closer, his fingers resting on the edge of the page. And what exactly sounded familiar? He asked, his tone measured, analytical. Maya stepped half a pace closer, careful not to intrude, her voice calm. When the clause allows post-acquisition liabilities to remain open-ended, it can shift future claims back to the buyer instead of the seller, especially if the language includes operational continuity. The room grew quieter, the earlier amusement fading into thoughtful stillness. One of the attorneys seated near the corner lifted his eyes from his tablet, his expression tightening slightly. Jonathan noticed the movement, his gaze flicking briefly toward him, then back to Maya. "You are saying the clause exposes us?" Jonathan said slowly. "It might, sir," Maya replied gently, her tone respectful rather than assertive. "If the operational responsibility remains undefined after closing, it can create unexpected obligations." The attorney leaned forward now, reaching toward the document, his fingers adjusting the page with careful precision. The faint rustle of paper sounded louder than expected in the quiet room. Jonathan watched him without speaking, his expression unreadable, while Maya remained still, her breathing steady, her attention focused yet unobtrusive. The attorney scanned the page quickly, then more slowly, his brow narrowing as he traced a paragraph with his finger. The executives around the table shifted subtly, sensing the shift in atmosphere. Outside, the distant glow of traffic lights moved silently across the glass walls, the city continuing its rhythm far below. Jonathan's pen rested quietly against the table now, forgotten for the moment, as the attorney paused, his jaw tightening slightly before he glanced up. The look he gave Jonathan was subtle but unmistakable, and in that quiet exchange, the confidence that had filled the room moments earlier softened into something more cautious. Jonathan leaned back slightly, his eyes returning to Maya Carter, studying her with a new stillness, as though the space between them had quietly changed. The attorney's finger remained on the paragraph as he read it again, slower this time, his eyes narrowing with careful focus. The faint hum of the air conditioning seemed louder now, filling the silence that had settled across the room. Jonathan Reeves watched him closely, his expression calm but attentive, while the other executives leaned slightly forward, sensing that something had shifted beyond routine discussion. The attorney adjusted his glasses, then cleared his throat softly, still not speaking immediately, as though weighing the implications before giving them voice. Maya Carter stood quietly beside the service cart, her hands resting lightly against the metal edge, her breathing steady, her gaze lowered but attentive. She did not move, did not interrupt, allowing the room to process the moment on its own. Jonathan finally spoke, his voice low and controlled. "Well?" The attorney exhaled quietly. "The language does leave room for extended operational liability," he said carefully. "If the acquired company has unresolved compliance issues, responsibility could shift to us after closing." A subtle tension moved across the table. One executive leaned back slowly, his earlier confidence fading, while another reached for the printed summary, scanning quickly. Jonathan's fingers tapped once against the polished wood, then stilled. "That was not part of the negotiated terms," he said calmly. "It may not have been intentional," the attorney replied, "but the phrasing allows interpretation." The word interpretation lingered in the air like a quiet warning. Jonathan leaned forward again, his eyes scanning the paragraph now, the earlier certainty replaced by focused scrutiny. The city lights outside reflected faintly across the glass walls, distant headlights moving like slow streams of light beneath the night sky. Maya felt the atmosphere shift, the room no longer relaxed but attentive, cautious. One of the executives spoke quietly. "If that holds, the exposure could extend for years." Another nodded slightly, adjusting his tie, his expression thoughtful. Jonathan turned another page, reviewing the surrounding sections, his movements controlled, deliberate. The pen rested untouched near his hand, forgotten in the moment. The attorney traced another line, then paused again, confirming what he had already seen. "It is subtle," he added, "but it is there." The quiet deepened. Jonathan leaned back slowly, his gaze lifting from the document to Maya Carter. The earlier amusement in his eyes had disappeared, replaced by measured consideration. He studied her for a moment, as though reassessing something he had dismissed too quickly. Maya remained composed, her posture calm, her expression neutral, neither proud nor nervous, simply present. Jonathan's voice softened slightly when he spoke again. You noticed this from listening? Maya nodded gently. Yes, sir. The phrasing sounded familiar. One of the executives glanced at her more closely now, curiosity replacing earlier indifference. Jonathan folded his hands lightly, the silence stretching for another brief moment, before he slid the contract away from the signing position. The movement was small, but its meaning filled the room. The decision to sign had paused. The tension eased slightly, replaced by thoughtful stillness. Jonathan Reeves looked once more at Maya Carter, the faint reflection of the chandelier in his eyes, and in that quiet moment, the balance in the room shifted, not dramatically, but enough that everyone present felt it. The contract rested farther from Jonathan Reeves now, no longer centered in front of him but slightly off to the side, a small movement that quietly changed the rhythm of the room. One of the executives leaned forward, folding his hands together, his voice careful. We should probably run a deeper review before moving forward. Another nodded slowly, the earlier ease replaced by quiet calculation. The attorney continued scanning the document, flipping back 2 pages, his finger tracing another paragraph as if testing whether the concern extended further. Maya Carter remained beside the service cart, still and composed, her presence no longer invisible but not fully acknowledged either. The soft hum of the city lights beyond the glass continued, distant and steady, while the silence inside the room settled into something more deliberate. Jonathan tapped the table lightly once, then looked toward Maya again, his expression thoughtful but guarded. You mentioned this sounded familiar, he said calmly. Where did you learn to recognize language like this? The question was not sharp, but it carried a quiet weight, and several executives shifted their attention toward her, curiosity growing. Maya hesitated for a fraction of a second, not from uncertainty, but from habit. She had learned that personal details often changed how people listened. I studied business law for a while, she answered softly. At a community college. A faint murmur moved around the table, subtle but noticeable. One of the executives raised his eyebrows slightly, while another leaned back, studying her more closely. Jonathan remained still, his gaze steady. For a while, he repeated. Maya nodded. Yes, sir. I completed 2 years before I had to stop. Why did you stop? The question came quietly, not intrusive, but direct. Maya's eyes lowered briefly toward the polished wood floor. My mother became ill. I needed to work full-time. The words settled gently in the air, without drama, without explanation beyond what was necessary. Jonathan watched her for a moment, his expression unreadable, then nodded slightly, as though filing the information away. The attorney cleared his throat again. There is another reference here, he said, turning the document slightly toward Jonathan. If we combine this clause with the indemnification section, the exposure becomes broader. Jonathan leaned forward once more, reviewing the indicated section carefully. The executives shifted again, their attention now fully focused on the document. One man exhaled quietly, the tension in the room becoming more visible in small movements, adjusted cuffs, tightened posture, measured glances. Maya stepped back half a pace, her role returning, but the atmosphere had changed. She reached for a water pitcher, refilling a glass slowly, the soft sound of water pouring into crystal briefly breaking the silence. No one spoke as Jonathan continued reviewing the pages, his pen resting untouched near his hand. After a long moment, he set the document down again, his voice calm but firm. We will postpone signing until this is reviewed thoroughly. A subtle shift moved through the room, not relief, but cautious agreement. The executives nodded quietly, while the attorney closed the folder halfway, signaling the pause. Jonathan's gaze lifted once more to Maya Carter, and for the first time since she had spoken, there was no trace of amusement in his expression, only a quiet acknowledgement that her presence in the room had changed the outcome. The quiet that followed settled gently across the room, no longer tense but reflective, like the moment after a storm passes and the air feels different even though nothing visible has changed. Jonathan Reeves leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking softly beneath him, his gaze drifting briefly toward the glass walls where the Chicago skyline shimmered in scattered lights. The city below moved steadily, headlights flowing along the highway like quiet streams, unaware that a decision 72 floors above had just shifted direction. The executives began gathering their notes slowly, their movements more deliberate than before, their earlier confidence replaced by thoughtful restraint. The attorney closed the folder fully this time, resting his hand on top of it, as though sealing the decision to wait. Maya Carter reached for the empty glasses, collecting them carefully onto her tray, her movements quiet and practiced, but inside she felt the faint release of tension she had been holding since she first spoke. She did not look toward Jonathan, not expecting acknowledgement, simply returning to the rhythm she understood best. The soft clink of crystal against silver echoed gently as she arranged the glasses, the sound blending with the muted hum of the air conditioning. One executive nodded politely as she passed, his expression thoughtful rather than dismissive, and another offered a quiet thank you as she refilled his water. The subtle shift in their tone did not go unnoticed, but Maya kept her focus steady, her posture calm. Jonathan remained seated, watching the slow movement of the room, his fingers resting loosely against the table. His gaze moved briefly to the contract, then back toward Maya as she lifted the tray. The chandelier light reflected faintly across her uniform, the worn fabric catching small highlights as she turned toward the service cart. Jonathan's expression softened slightly, not into a smile, but into something more reflective, as though reconsidering assumptions he had made too quickly. The room grew quieter as chairs shifted back and folders were gathered, the meeting dissolving into small, quiet movements rather than abrupt endings. Outside, a faint breeze brushed against the glass, barely visible but enough to stir the reflections of light across the polished table. Maya guided the service cart toward the door, her steps measured, her shoulders relaxed now that the pressure of the moment had passed. She paused briefly to adjust a folded napkin, aligning it neatly before continuing. Jonathan stood slowly, the motion drawing subtle attention, but he did not speak immediately. Instead, he glanced once more at the contract, then toward the skyline, then finally toward Maya Carter as she reached the doorway. The quiet between them held for a moment, not uncomfortable, but thoughtful, like two separate paths that had briefly crossed. Maya pushed the door open gently, the soft click echoing as the hallway lights spilled into the room. The air outside felt cooler, quieter, and she stepped forward, her tray balanced carefully, her footsteps soft against the carpeted corridor. Behind her, the door closed slowly, and the meeting room settled into stillness again, but the silence no longer carried dismissal. It carried recognition, quiet and unspoken, lingering in the space long after she had stepped into the hallway. The hallway outside the executive dining room felt quieter, the thick carpet soft beneath Maya Carter's steps as she guided the service cart forward. The overhead lights glowed warm against the polished walls, and the distant sound of an elevator bell echoed faintly from down the corridor. She exhaled slowly, her shoulders easing as the tension from the meeting dissolved into the calm rhythm of her work. The tray rattled gently as she adjusted the glasses, the faint clink of crystal returning her to familiar ground. Inside the room she had just left, decisions worth millions of dollars had paused, but out here, the world returned to small details, folded napkins, polished silver, measured steps. Maya pushed open the service station door, the cooler air brushing softly against her face. Stainless steel counters reflected the fluorescent lights above, and the scent of brewed coffee lingered faintly in the background. She placed the glasses carefully into the rack, her movements precise, her breathing steady. For a moment she allowed herself to pause, resting her hands lightly against the counter, her thoughts drifting back to the contract, the quiet shift in Jonathan Reeves's expression, and the stillness that followed her words. She did not expect anything to come from it. She had spoken because it felt necessary, not because she believed it would change her life. The soft hum of the refrigerator filled the silence, and she reached for a clean towel, drying her hands slowly. Down the hallway, footsteps approached, measured and unhurried. Maya did not turn immediately, assuming it was another server finishing a shift, but the steps slowed near the doorway. She glanced up gently, her expression calm, and saw Jonathan Reeves standing just outside the service station, his presence filling the doorway without urgency. His jacket hung neatly over one arm, his posture relaxed but thoughtful. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The quiet felt different here, smaller, more personal than the vast dining room. Jonathan stepped inside slightly, the polished floor reflecting the soft overhead light. "Miss Carter," he said, his voice even, no longer carrying the distant authority it had held at the table. Maya straightened slightly, surprised but composed. "Yes, sir." He glanced briefly at the glass rack, then back at her, as though adjusting to the contrast between the executive room and this quiet workspace. "I wanted to confirm something," he said calmly. "You said you studied business law." Maya nodded gently. "Yes, sir." Jonathan considered her for a moment, his gaze thoughtful rather than skeptical. "You noticed that clause quickly." Maya hesitated slightly, then answered softly. "I recognized the phrasing. It sounded similar to cases we studied." Jonathan nodded once, his expression reflective. The faint sound of the elevator bell echoed again in the distance, and the quiet between them stretched for a moment. He glanced briefly toward the hallway, then back to her. "You may have saved us from a complicated situation tonight." Maya lowered her eyes slightly, her voice calm. "I was just trying to help, sir." Jonathan watched her for a moment longer, as though weighing something unspoken. The fluorescent lights reflected faintly across the stainless steel counter, and the hum of the refrigerator continued steadily in the background. Then he gave a small nod, subtle but sincere, before turning slightly toward the doorway, the quiet recognition lingering in the air between them as the distance between their worlds narrowed, even if only for a moment. Jonathan Reeves paused at the doorway, his hand resting lightly against the frame as though he was considering whether to leave or say something more. The quiet hum of the service station wrapped around them, steady and unobtrusive, and Maya Carter returned her attention to aligning the glass rack, her movements calm and deliberate. She sensed he had not left yet, but she did not rush to fill the silence. Jonathan finally stepped fully into the room, placing his jacket neatly across the back of a nearby chair, an action that felt more deliberate than necessary. "How long ago did you stop studying?" he asked, his voice quieter now, less formal than before. Maya folded the towel in her hands, her gaze soft but composed. "About 3 years ago, sir." Jonathan nodded slowly, his eyes drifting briefly across the stainless steel counter, then back to her. "You plan to continue?" It was not quite a question, more an observation shaped by what he had already seen. Maya gave a small nod. "Yes, sir. That was the plan." The fluorescent lights reflected faintly across the polished surfaces, and the faint sound of distant footsteps echoed down the hallway beyond the door. Jonathan studied her for a moment, as though calculating something quietly. "You handled that room with composure," he said calmly. "Most people would have hesitated." Maya allowed a small, thoughtful pause before answering. "I almost did, sir." Jonathan's expression softened slightly, the faintest hint of understanding passing across his features. "But you did not." Maya shook her head gently. "It felt important." Jonathan rested one hand lightly on the counter, his posture relaxed but attentive. "It was." The two words settled into the quiet space, simple but sincere. Maya lowered her eyes briefly, not out of discomfort, but humility. She reached for another rack, adjusting the glasses carefully, the faint clink echoing softly. Jonathan watched the movement, then spoke again. "If you had continued your studies, what direction would you have taken?" Maya considered the question for a moment. "Corporate compliance," she answered softly. "I liked understanding how contracts protect people." Jonathan nodded slowly, his gaze thoughtful. "You already understand more than most people in those rooms." Maya shook her head slightly. "I just remember what I learned." Jonathan allowed a brief silence, then reached into the inner pocket of his jacket, pulling out a slim business card. He placed it gently on the counter, not pushing it toward her, simply setting it there between them. The card rested against the stainless steel surface, clean and understated. "If you ever decide to return to your studies," he said calmly, Call my office. Maya glanced down at the card, then back at him, surprise flickering briefly across her eyes before settling into quiet composure. Thank you, sir. Jonathan nodded once, his expression steady. Talent should not stay hidden. The refrigerator hummed softly in the background, and the quiet weight of his words lingered in the room. Maya picked up the card carefully, her fingers brushing its smooth edge, as Jonathan reached for his jacket again. He turned toward the doorway, pausing briefly before stepping into the hallway, leaving behind a stillness that felt warmer than before, as though something subtle but meaningful had shifted between them. The hallway lights glowed softly as Jonathan Reeves's footsteps faded into the distance, leaving Maya Carter standing quietly beside the stainless steel counter, the business card resting lightly between her fingers. She turned it over once, reading the clean, understated lettering, then placed it carefully into the small pocket of her apron as though it were something fragile. The refrigerator hummed steadily, and the faint sound of dishes clinking echoed from farther down the service corridor. Maya exhaled slowly, her shoulders easing, then returned to her routine, stacking the final glasses and wiping the counter with measured, familiar movements. Outside the service station, the evening continued, staff moving quietly through their shifts, elevators chiming softly as guests arrived and departed. Yet something inside her felt different, not dramatic, just a quiet shift, like a door opening slightly where there had once been a wall. She finished organizing the rack and stepped into the hallway, pushing the service cart toward the elevator. The carpet softened her footsteps, and the warm lighting reflected faintly along the polished walls. Through a nearby window, she caught a glimpse of the city again, the lights stretching far into the night, the skyline steady and endless. She paused briefly, her hand resting on the cart handle, her eyes following the distant movement of traffic far below. 72 floors up, the world looked calm, almost peaceful, and she allowed herself a quiet breath before continuing forward. Down the hall, another server passed her with a small nod, and Maya returned the gesture, her expression calm but thoughtful. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime, and she guided the cart inside, pressing the button for the lower service floor. As the doors closed, the faint hum of the elevator filled the space, and she glanced once more toward the city lights before they disappeared behind brushed steel doors. The descent was smooth and quiet, the numbers counting down. Slowly, each floor passing with a gentle glow. When the elevator opened again, the air felt cooler, the lighting softer, the familiar rhythm of the service level welcoming her back. She pushed the cart forward, placing it in its designated spot, then removed her apron, folding it carefully before setting it aside. The business card remained in her pocket, a small weight she could still feel. Maya reached for her coat, slipping it on as she walked toward the exit. The night air greeted her as she stepped outside, cool and calm, the city stretching wide around her. Cars moved along the street, headlights reflecting off the pavement, and the distant sound of traffic blended into a steady hum. She walked slowly toward the bus stop, her hands tucked into her coat pockets, her pace unhurried. Above her, the tall glass tower reflected the skyline, its upper floors glowing faintly in the night. Somewhere high above, decisions would continue, contracts would be reviewed, and plans would shift, but for now, the night felt still. Maya paused at the corner, the breeze brushing softly against her face, and she looked once more at the building behind her, its lights steady against the dark sky. She did not smile, did not speak, but her posture carried a quiet confidence that had not been there before. The bus arrived with a gentle hiss, and she stepped forward, climbing aboard, the doors closing softly behind her as the city lights continued to move, calm and steady, like the quiet promise of something beginning without needing to be said.